Problem I've had for a while using gyro aiming is that most games that are easy, relatively speaking, to set it up in don't take full advantage of it. Sure, it's a valid replacement for using an analog stick, but one could also argue you could just use a mouse. Indeed, due to the fact it rests on a solid surface and thus does not jitter or sway, a mouse will always be superior to gyro anyway. But gyro offers something to the experience of aiming a weapon in a shooter that a mouse can't. Yet it is nearly impossible to actually experience outside of VR. When controller defenders say that yanking the triggers on one feels better than clicking a mouse, they're not wrong. It's certainly closer to the actual act of pulling a trigger than a mouse click is. This argument falls apart the minute they start defending dual stick controls and aim assist, of course, but the point still stands. It's a more tactilely immersive experience to fire a gun in a game with the triggers on a gamepad than by clicking a mouse. Of course, going into VR would amp this up even further, but we'll put VR aside here since most people don't and probably wouldn't play most games in VR anyway. Gyro enhances this sensation by mapping your point of aim to the motion of the controller and thus your hands. When your hands sway, your aim sways. When your hands jitter, your aim jitters. Every game with any kind of realistic gun aiming has faked this by implementing aim sway. It has to, else your weapon sights would never deviate from where you point them since they are, absent your input, totally at rest. Not so with gyro. The controller is always in your hands, so your aim is always slightly moving. Faked weapon sway is no longer necessary when using gyro. Sadly, since no shooters are designed primarily to use it, any games that want to bother with weapon sway will fake it in for the sake of the other input methods, meaning a gyro user may have to fight the fake sway and their own sway at the same time, depending on how it's implemented. Assuming that isn't an issue, however, you're left with the most immersive, most skill-demanding type of weapon aiming outside of VR, as you're forced to try and hold your hand steady to line up shots and must keep from jerking yourself off target when pulling the trigger, just like when firing an actual gun. The problem is that, as I said above, most games it is easy to use gyro in don't take advantage of this immersive aiming quality because they're hipfire-based shooters with limited or no aim-down sights, where these mechanics actually matter. The easiest games to play with gyro are Valve games, Fortnite, and Call of Duty. Valve's games have a great retroactive implementation, but they're all hipfire shooters. Other than scopes on long-range weapons, they have no ADS, and are thus much more about point and shoot. Same goes for Halo. Same for Fortnite. Call of Duty does have ADS, which means it actually can take advantage of gyro to make its shooting feel more immersive, but only really in the campaign, because multiplayer so advantages aim assist that you're objectively at a disadvantage, always, if you're not using it. This means both gyro and mice are non-competitive. Literally, COD competitive players do not use mice, which means most of the time you spend in the game, if you even want to. COD has degenerated into literal AI-generated slop at this point, will not be with gyro. Nevertheless, if you're a junkie for this kind of experience, I'd recommend the Black Ops 6 campaign using gyro, especially the Scud Hunt mission. That was the first time I'd ever done sniping in a game that wasn't Halo with gyro, and it was so good. Poking over a sand dune and fighting my own arms to keep my aim still so I could pop heads at long range, trying not to jerk off target when I pulled the trigger, it just felt right. The normal critics of mouse aiming may just be coping to defend their aim bots, but they aren't wrong to say that using a mouse to shoot a gun feels like you're playing head clicker. It is, in a very literal sense, point and shoot. Using gyro for aimed fire requires control of your arms, wrists, hands, etc. It requires far more effort to pull off an accurate shot than with a mouse. Landing shots really feels earned. The tragedy is that this should make gyro a perfect match for tactical shooters and milsims, which prioritize realism far more than mainstream shooters, but it isn't, for two reasons. One, players of these games are so used to playing with mice, it would be financially insane for anyone to make one that doesn't support using a mouse, and therefore Gyro would still find itself outclassed, since the vast majority of these games are multiplayer, and the inherent stability of mouse aiming versus gyro aiming would always give the mouse the edge. 2, these games are virtually always assumed to be played on a PC with a mouse and keyboard, and they take advantage of that keyboard to complicate their control schemes. Thus, none that I can think of are playable with a gamepad anyway, because there are simply not enough buttons on it. Except for Arma Reforger. I admittedly have not tested this, since I'm not interested in paying for a tech demo. I'll wait for Arma 4 to come out, thanks. But I'll just say I'm skeptical of how smooth the controller experience is, given how many controls Arma has. My perusing of the Steam forums hasn't alleviated my skepticism, but I'll refrain from making a definitive statement, given I haven't played it myself. I will say, though, that Arma 4 may be the best shot we have to bring Gyro into a tactical shooter environment where that kind of immersive aiming would be appropriate. Sadly, it will still have the problem that mouse players, the overwhelming majority of the players, will still have the advantage, but unlike almost all other tactical shooters, Arma is not a purely multiplayer game, which makes this less of an issue. Again, though, they would need to somehow condense the control scheme to fit comfortably on a controller, and I'm just skeptical about that. I realize this is all rather trivial, complaining about a niche of a niche for the sake of an ephemeral sense of partial immersion through a control input, and I'm not even saying I expect this to get resolved in my favor at some point. I highly doubt it. In fact, I just wanted to lament it, that there's a missed opportunity for immersion in shooter mechanics with Gyro that the alternatives outside of VR don't offer.